In the name of God, who in the Trinity is Creator, Redeemer and Sanctifier. Amen. 20 years ago, on Thursday of this past week, 7-year-old Abbas Nazari looked out across the sea and saw an upside-down triangle on the horizon, which represented one thing: salvation. Ben Doherty in The Guardian recounted this week that even though Nazari was weakened by dehydration and illness, disorientated and battered by the terrifying storm that had incapacitated the small boat carrying him and hundreds of others, Nazari remembers staring over the sea at the ship that would rescue them. I can't properly describe it, Nazari said. It was just a huge amount of relief, especially given what we went through the night before, an almost out-of-body experience. It was just incredible. We were saved. That triangle on the horizon was the MV Tampa, a Norwegian freighter that would sail to his and his family's rescue, along with 426 other asylum seekers, mostly from Afghanistan. The images of that day and of that rescue provoked strong reactions within the Australian community and political life. 20 years on, we have watched similarly distressing scenes of incredible courage and self-sacrifice as refugees scrambled to board planes which equally signified salvation. Marise Payne, Minister for Foreign Affairs, summed up these feelings this week when she said, "Those scenes are deeply distressing and have unfortunately been replicated on a number of times in the last days and week in relation to a whole range of individuals trying to seek evacuation. I have heard reports of the attacks on women, attacks on children, threats at checkpoints, invasions of transports, where children and families have been threatened in those transports as they have been trying to get to the airport. The complexity of this is significant." Complexity is an understatement. We know for the members of our veterans community that the events in Afghanistan in these past weeks have been enormously painful, as they have watched all for which they risked their lives be overturned, and those with whom they worked alongside placed in extreme danger. And as with the asylum seekers on the MV Tampa 20 years ago, so there has been strong response to the plight of those seeking refuge and asylum, especially as many risked their lives and the lives of their families to align themselves with people in whom they saw salvation and hope for a better way of life. Our hearts cry out at the injustice and the inhumanity of what we witness. And yet in the midst of this, we hear voices of caution, voices of fear, voices that warn that those who are fleeing danger may yet pose a danger to those who offer sanctuary. If we are pondering where sin and evil are here, it would seem that being trapped in a cycle of damnation by external forces is less than of God, is less than holy. To seek asylum, to seek refuge, is not an easy decision. In the poem I linked to in my pastoral letter this week, Kenyan-born Somali poet Warsan Shire wrote, "You only leave home when home won't let you stay." Shire continues evocatively, "No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck, and even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles travelled means something more than the journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. Shire's full poem is confronting, challenging, and this week, as I reflected on the situation in Kabul and on the 20th anniversary of the MV Tampa incident, where some seem to deem rescue and salvation as a sin, I could not let go of Warsan Shire's words. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Captain Arne Rinnen, captain of the MV Tampa, acted according to maritime law and instruction when he answered the distress call of the Palapa, the ship on which 7-year-old Abbas Nazari was on 20 years ago. It was, however, compassion which led him to take these refugees to the nearest port, Christmas Island, for urgent medical care and humanitarian assistance. Acting with compassion for Captain Rinnen meant ignoring multiple threats of persecution and directives from the then Australian government to not land at Christmas Island, but rather turn his ship around. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So wrote James in his letter that we heard this morning. It's clear where the letter writer places godliness and holiness in regard to those who are in need. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror, for they look at themselves and, on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. As Nicholas King says in his commentary on this passage, for our author, religion is more than just sitting in church. It needs to be tested by what happens in real life, the link between what we claim and what we do. That includes difficult things like showing love for the marginalised and the poor. So as we contemplate these things, the events of the past weeks and of 20 years ago, it can all feel like a bit of a train wreck and that we are helpless onlookers. However, as the Reverend Dr. Julia Perry reminded us in her sermon last week, this is not a train wreck, but a freedom train, a train of liberty, and we're invited to get on board. We're invited to take action, to speak up, to amplify our voice so that it speaks the things of God and calls those with responsibility and leadership to godly wisdom, that is freedom. This is salvation calling. Over the past few lockdown weeks, we've heard about climate change refugees and asylum seekers. But being locked down doesn't mean that our faith is locked down. Indeed, now is the time when our voices must be amplified, proclaiming hope and salvation in a world that feels hopeless. In your pew slips this week, you will find a link to the call from our bishops, ABM and Christians across Australia to live the practical compassion of Jesus, to call on our government to do more to help people in Afghanistan, to urge our government to welcome a special intake of 20,000 Afghan refugees, and to support the ongoing well-being of all Afghan refugees and their families. In a similar vein is Amnesty International's campaign Act for Afghanistan, which encourages you to sign a petition and to contact politicians to give voice for the voiceless. For those who say that this is all part of woke culture, I argue that it is actually a call to being awake, awake to what is around us, awake to our faith. And if that is deemed as being woke, then I'd rather be woke-en than be asleep. I'd rather be awake and know who I am than look in a mirror and forget my identity. For as the Epistle of James says, we cannot be silent in the face of evil, for if we are, then we do forget our very identity as people of faith. In 2016, this cathedral joined with other cathedrals and churches throughout Australia as part of a sanctuary network, offering places of sanctuary to those seeking asylum, a place of safety in Australia. This action of churches and cathedrals challenged the legal system then and led to ongoing discussions and ramifications. Today, as the Dean, I recommit this cathedral as a place of sanctuary and commit that we are a parish of inclusion and welcome and safety, especially for those who come from across the seas. Over 2,000 years ago, a young single mother, her infant son, and the mother's fiancé fled genocide and tyranny and sought refuge in a land across the border. May we always see the face of Christ in those who seek refuge. May we always remember our identity, whose we are and whose we are called. May we always give voice for the vulnerable, for this is religion which is pure and undefiled before God. This is the way of salvation. Amen.